Okay, good morning, everyone. We are going to get started. I know there'll still be some people coming in as we go because of the weather and whatnot, but I want to respect all of you who, the hale and hearty who made it out here on time in the bad weather. So we'll get started to give you the full benefit of the time we have allotted. I'm Craig Snyder, for those of you who don't know, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. I want to start with our customary reminder. If you haven't already done so, please silence your phones and other electronic devices. I appreciate your being out here this morning. This is the first of a new category of programs that we're experimenting with at the Council, a series of breakfasts on business-related topics, and we certainly have an important one of those today. The Council has a full schedule of timely events coming up this spring. Too many for me to list here. I do want to just mention a couple that are coming up very soon. March 10th, Thursday, next week, the Council will present author Jeffrey Stern, who's a Philadelphia native, discussing his new book, The Last 1,000, One School's Promise in a Nation at War. This is an important story and really a metaphor for a larger discussion about the lasting consequences of American involvement in Afghanistan and American withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the consequences of both sides of those coins. On Tuesday, April 12th, the Council will be hosting Understanding the Muslim World, Were We Fooled by the Promise of an Arab Spring, with a keynote by former Ambassador Mark Grossman, who's really a fabulous speaker if you have not seen him before, followed by a panel discussion with some really distinguished commentators, Joby Warwick and Robert Worth. This is the second in our three-part series on the West in the Muslim world and the Muslim world in the West. And then on Friday, April 29th, we are presenting what I think is going to be a very important event with General Petraeus coming to the Council for an exclusive members-only luncheon. If you're not yet a member, we have offers outstanding for people to become members in order to attend that program. It's one of General Petraeus' first ventures out into public view since the controversial circumstances of his last couple of years, but obviously he remains one of the most experienced and in some ways thoughtful people on national security issues. And we're going to talk to him about the national security environment that the next president of the United States, whoever he or she may be, is going to be responsible for. For complete information about these and the rest of our programs, please see our Council staff here today or visit our website. Our speaker events like these and our Council citizen diplomacy tours, along with the support of members and partners, enable the Council to offer our most important category of programs, a diverse set of programs for over 2,200 middle and high school students in 90 schools throughout the Philadelphia area, fostering the skills and sensibilities that we believe the next generation simply must have in order to thrive in the globalized world that we're going to be talking about today. We have a number of students with us today. Hope to hear questions from you. And now I'm going to introduce Joe D'Angelo, a member of the Council's board and the Dean of the Hobbs School of Business at St. Joseph's University. Dr. D'Angelo has been recognized by two highly regarded organizations, among others, the Association to Advance Collegiate Schools of Business and the Philadelphia Insurance Society, for his outstanding commitment to advancing business education. He is a great supporter of the Council. We're proud to have him as a partner. Please come on up, Joe.
Thank you, Greg, and welcome everyone today. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. I know I am. Welcome to the students of St. Joe's. I thought you'd be gone. Semester break is Monday, so. As can be seen in our daily lives, the world is incredibly connected, and something that happens to us in the United States influences and impacts people all around the world. Globalization is a powerful force and brings the world closer every day. From politics and economics to social media to fashion trends, we are all linked in the global society. Joining us this morning is Jeffrey Garten, Dean Emeritus, I would like to get that title sometime, at the Yale School of Management, where he teaches courses on the global economy. Prior to joining Yale in 1996, he served in the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations, and he was Under Secretary of Commerce in the Clinton administration. Jeffrey also was the managing director at Lehman Brothers, where he specialized in debt restructuring in Latin America and Asia, and subsequently worked in mergers and acquisitions as a managing director at the Blackstone Group. He has written widely on global topics in Business Week, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and the Harvard Business Review, and is the author of 5 books on global economics and politics. How in God's name you were able to do that and still be a dean is beyond me. Right? His new book, From Silk to Silicon, discusses the history of globalization through the lens of individuals and their transformative achievements, linking such figures as Genghis Khan, Meyer Amschel Rothschild, Cyrus Field, and Margaret Thatcher. Jeffrey will probe the questions: how much influence can one person have in fundamentally changing the world? And how have past trends in globalization affected the present, and how will they shape the future? Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Garten.
So when most people think about globalization, they think of it as a modern phenomenon. So I want to ask, to start, why did you write a book that goes back to the 12th century? And why did you write a book that focuses on individuals rather than broad statistical trends?
Well, you know, I've always, excuse me, I've always had an interest in globalization. So I was brought up as the son of an army officer, and when I was just a couple of weeks old, I moved. My mother moved me. I didn't move, but my mother moved me to Germany for the occupation after the Second World War. And all my life, I've been moving around, and all my professional life, I have been working in one aspect or another of the global economy. So I've had this long interest in the subject. And before now, I've written about it from several angles, but they were mostly policy angles. I think the reason that I chose to write about globalization through the life and times of different people actually stemmed from an experience I had a long time ago, in 1971. I was a soldier, I was a captain, and I was stationed, it was in the Vietnam era, and I was stationed on the border between Thailand and Burma. And for most of the time, I was operating alone. And in those days, American soldiers, by law, had to get mail once a week. It didn't matter where they were, it didn't matter how remote the location was, the government was obligated to get them their mail. And for me, the only way I could get the mail was that it would be dropped from a little plane. So once a week, I'd hear this plane coming, and they drop a little package, and somebody from Chicago had bought me a subscription to the Book of the Month Club. And the thing is, you know, the mail would come through Saigon, and then, I don't know how it got there, it was picked up, flown to Thailand. But in the mailroom in Saigon, they stole all the books. And I never got a book, except once. A book came, and the book was called Stilwell and the American Experience in China. It was by a very well-known historian named Margaret Thatcher. And this was a story about General Stilwell during the Second World War, who was in charge of the China area. Now, the book was 1,000 pages, and it was all about General Stilwell, but it was all about China. And this historian weaved together the life of this general and everything we were doing, the U.S. was doing in China. And I was so riveted I mean, partially because, I was 21 and there I was in Asia for the first time. But also, I was just taken that through this biography, I learned so much about China. And, fortunately, unfortunately, it was the only book I had, so I read that 1,000 pages 3 different times. And I said to myself then, this is what I'm going to do for my life. I'm going to write political biographies, historical biographies. Of course, I got out of the Army, I went to graduate school, it never happened, and my life took a different course. But I never, ever forgot how interesting that was as a way to even understand current events. And so this time, when I started to write a book, about 7 years ago, I said, I'm going to write about globalization that way. I'm going to do something which I didn't think had been done before, which is to look at a number of people, their life and times, and pick people who did something that made the world smaller and more connected, and who did it in such a powerful way that they changed their world when they did it. And as you said, I went back 800 years. But they also did something that continues to change our world, so that it was such a spectacular achievement, it just kept reverberating through the ages. So I picked 10 people, arbitrary number, but I thought that's as much as I could do and as much as the traffic would bear. And I said, I want people who did something unbelievably impressive. Second, I want people who not only had a great idea, but they made the idea happen. That is, they were distinguished not only by the idea, but by the ability to execute the idea, the ability to implement it. And third, I wanted to pick people who were right at the beginning of something that we could call an age. So I wrote about somebody who really started the age of empire, which was Genghis Khan. And somebody who started the age of global exploration. And someone who started the age of colonization, because that had a lot to do with globalization. And someone who started the age of global finance. And I went down the various ages that I thought were the building blocks for the world that we live in today. And every one of the chapters that I wrote tells the life and times of somebody. It's a mini biography. Although, as a friend of mine said, I had no idea. I almost wrote 10 books because if a chapter is 50 pages, if you write 50 pages about someone, you might as well go ahead and write the whole book because you're doing so much research to get to 50 pages. But there are many historical biographies. But each one ends with today. That is, it asks the question, what does this person have to do with our world right now and the world in the future? And at the end of the book, I started this with no idea of whether these 10 people would have anything in common. And I had no hypothesis. I was just going to write the stories. And then when I was done, for a whole year, I just looked at those stories. I read them, and tried to come up with 3 or 4 things that they had in common. And I think I found some powerful themes, which are themes that help us to look at people today. A Jeff Bezos, a Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and ask the question, are they doing something as fantastic as the 10 people I'm writing about? Do they have that capability? Or for some of you in the audience, you can read this and then ask, what would it take? If I really wanted to change the world, and just assuming there's something about the 10 people that I picked, do I have what they had? Could I possibly have what they had? And the last chapter kind of discusses exactly what that happened. So that's the story.
Thank you. It's a wonderful overview. So I want to, since the book just came out, and most of the audience, I'm sure, hasn't had a chance to read it yet. We're hoping everybody will take it and read it after today. But I do want to go through. We won't go through all 10. I want to go through some of the cases that you spent so much time on, and ask you to kind of give the highlights of what you think their contribution was, and as you said, the way in which it connects to today. So let's start at the very beginning. Genghis Khan. Why should we care today?
Well, most people know about Genghis Khan through only one lens. And if I were to ask anyone of you, say, Genghis Khan, give me one word, you're going to say brutality, or pillage, or something that really evidences somebody who basically rampaged over all of Asia. And it's true, Genghis Khan amassed the largest landmass empire in history, even through today. That is, he conquered the space between the Pacific Ocean and all the way to Eastern Europe, contiguous. And there is nobody who has ever even come close to that. And of course, we're talking about a vast variety of cultures. I mean, we're not only talking about China, and Mongolia, but we're talking about the entire Persian Gulf, the Middle East, Turkey, the Baltics. But the story that I'm telling is that what happened after he conquered that, he built an infrastructure that very few people understand. He opened the Silk Roads. So he opened the Silk Roads, which were actual roads where trade could take place. And the Silk Roads were much older than Genghis Khan. The Silk Roads were over 6,000 years old. But you couldn't go from one end to the other. You could go several miles, and then there would be a group of people that would basically rob you or extort high tariffs or shoot you. I mean, it was a terribly barbarian kind of trade route. He opened the whole thing. He gave people passports. He gave them protection. So he created trade through most of the known world. Secondly, he created communication systems. He had what we would call a Pony Express. You could actually get a letter all across the Eurasian continent through horse relays. He created an administrative structure from Mongolia, where he lived, in which he actually ruled over this entire arena, but he did something that we can't do today, which is he gave extreme freedom for all the various cultures to practice their own religion. He conceived of globalization in a very sophisticated way. He went to Persia. He got doctors from Persia, brought them to China to teach the Chinese modern medicine. He got ceramic makers from China. He brought them to other parts of the world to teach them how to make ceramics. I mean, this is what globalization is. It's the interaction. It's the transfer of information. It's the transfer of goods. It's the transfer of culture. So I use him basically. It was sort of arbitrary. I started with him because I thought it was very interesting that 800 years ago, all the energy came out of the East. And I end the book with Deng Xiaoping, who opened China to the world not very long ago. And once again, the energy is coming from the East. So I wanted that kind of symmetry. I could have gone back further, but I must say, this already taxed any capability I had to go back this way.
Okay, Cyrus Field. Did he invent the information age?
In a way, he did. Cyrus Field, to tell you this story, Cyrus Field was businessman in New York City. We're talking the mid-1800s. And he made a fortune in selling fancy stationery. In those days, the United States didn't have fancy stationery. Europeans did. And he saw that stationery and he brought it back to the U.S., manufactured it here. Became fabulously wealthy at the age of about 30 or 31. And his doctor said to him, you have to retire or you're going to die. You're just working too hard. So he retired to a big mansion in Gramercy Park, New York, with nothing to do. And he had a brother who was an engineer. And the brother happened to meet somebody from Newfoundland, Canada. And this guy from Newfoundland had the license to connect the telegraph from Newfoundland to the U.S. mainland. And he ran out of money. And so Cyrus Field's brother went to Cyrus Field and said, look, you're 30, you've got all this money in the world, would you bankroll the extension of the telegraph from Newfoundland to the U.S. mainland? Cyrus Field said, I don't know anything about the telegraph. I don't even know where Newfoundland is. I don't know why you bother. So the brother was very embarrassed and he left. Cyrus Field goes into his study and he decides to look at a map because he'd heard of Newfoundland, but he didn't know where it was. So he's looking all over and finally he sees Newfoundland's up there in Canada, but it juts way out. And actually, it's like 25% on the way to Europe. So he says to himself, why would you want to extend the telegraph from Newfoundland to the U.S. when you could do it from Newfoundland to Ireland and basically make the telegraph go across the border? Because that had never been done before. We had a telegraph in the U.S., but it ended at the shore. And the Europeans had a telegraph, and it ended at their shore. And it took several weeks for information to get from Europe to the U.S. or the U.S. to Europe. In fact, information traveled no faster in the 1850s and 60s across the Atlantic than it had for thousands of years, because it was all about the wind. It depended on how strong the winds were. So Cyrus Field, with no knowledge of technology, this was what was called it was kind of the Victorian age, but also the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age in the United States was an age of enormous wealth and enormous technological triumphs. We had the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers. So it wasn't unusual to think really big. And Cyrus Field was one of those guys. And he got together all the scientists and all the technologists, and he said, could it be done? Could we take a telegraph and lay it across the entire Atlantic Ocean? And they said, well, no, we don't know how deep the Atlantic Ocean is. Nobody had ever measured the Atlantic Ocean. And they said, besides, a telegraph can't go very far without a relay station. That is, the electrical impulse, it only goes a certain way and then it needs to be reinforced. How are we going to do that across the ocean? And Field just refused. Maybe because he didn't know any better, he just refused to believe it couldn't be done. And my story is the story of the next 15 years in which there was failure after failure, and then one day, and these failures, they're really interesting stories of what he had to do and the humiliation, because the whole world was watching this. And each time it failed, the stock market crashed, and all bad kinds of bad things happened. He had to hide out in New York incognito. One day, on the fourth try, they connected the telegraph from Newfoundland to Ireland. And at that moment, the world had real-time communications. And within a few years, the entire world was wired. It was the most dramatic story, and all of us here, well, most of us, have had the experience of seeing the internet arrive. A lot of you were born, it was already here. But for someone like me, I think both of us, right? We lived most of our lives without the internet, and when the internet came, my God, that was really dramatic. And some of you probably can't imagine the world before that. But you know, the internet was nothing compared to the transatlantic cable. Because when the internet came, I could still turn on the TV and watch the war in Vietnam or Tiananmen massacre right on TV. So I had real-time world communications. The internet made it deeper and expanded the possibilities. But this transatlantic cable, you went, it's as though the room were totally dark and boom, all of a sudden the light came on. Changed everything. And from that came the telephone, the radio, the television, and the internet. So I think that the way you put it is right, that Cyrus Field really was the beginning, I would say, of the global age of communication.
Maybe the most controversial of the characters that you chose to write about, in terms of the decision to include in this sort of pantheon, would be Margaret Thatcher. So tell us why you think she fits in this relatively small group of people that essentially, you know, you're saying define ages in globalization.
So I have to give a little background here because you're absolutely right. A lot of people say to me, why Margaret Thatcher? So in order to understand the monumental impact that she had, you have to know that the world was not always focused on relatively free markets. Another way of saying it is that, you know, we live pretty much in an age of laissez-faire. It's not totally that way, but certainly the orientation is towards letting markets work. And after the Russian Revolution in 1918, and then the First World War, and then the Great Depression, governments basically came into markets and tried to control them. And by the 1970s, the world was moving in a slowly towards quite a socialist direction. That is very strong government intervention in everything. And it was very heavy in Europe and very heavy particularly in Britain. And Margaret Thatcher was the first woman ever to rise to the top of the British government. And in the British government there, at that time, there were 2 or 3 parties, and each party had somebody who could be prime minister. And if they weren't prime minister, they were considered to be prime minister in waiting, and that's what she was. And everything in Britain had collapsed. That is, the government had been so stifled the markets in the 1970s that England was bankrupt. Everyone was on strike because basically the government, most of the workers were in government unions, and the country had come to a total stop. There were no garbage collections. If you died, you couldn't be buried. There was no transportation. And you know, it was an England that nobody here can imagine or can remember. And in that moment, Margaret Thatcher was elected as the Prime Minister. And from the very first day, she took a sledgehammer and just broke the model that existed. And she said the only way we can get out of this is to have free markets. That governments can't control everything. That we have to have more room for entrepreneurs. That we have to let business do what business can do. And over the next 8 years, she changed the very fabric of England and let the markets do their thing. And there was a very dramatic recovery in England. So much so that other countries around the world decided to follow that example. And so this free market experiment in England spread to Europe, and I would say it also spread to China. Because in the 1980s, for the first time in 50 years, China started to open to the world. China started to follow a much freer trade policy. So Margaret Thatcher had this enormous influence of basically changing the economic, philosophical mindset of virtually most of the world. And one very concrete example is that in England, most of the companies were owned by the government, if you can believe it. The transportation was owned by the government. The energy companies were owned by the government. And she did something that nobody had ever done in history, is that she forced those companies to be sold to private investors. So they went from government companies to private companies, to commercial companies. And all over the world, people followed that example. Whether it was Poland, whether it was Argentina. The U.S. never really had government-owned companies, but we had one or two. We got rid of them as well. And so she set this enormous example. The world changed. And she wasn't sitting back in her study. She was directing all of this. So she was really a doer. The thing is, though, that in doing what she did, she also created an enormous number of problems. It was then that some people got very rich and some people got very poor. All the issues that we talk about today in the United States, or that are talked about in the world, income inequality, wealth inequality, the way that trade helps some people but hurts other people, a lot of these issues, somewhere in our crazy election, all of that derives from what's called the Thatcher Revolution. That is, she opened up globalization for both good and bad. And the reason this is so important is that she kind of set the agenda for, she was out of office by, I think 1990, 91. She set the agenda for globalization for years, not only for now, but for years to come. Because we don't have the answer. We don't know, how do you open things up? How do you give entrepreneurs all the opportunity they deserve? And at the same time, how do you have enough fairness so that everybody participates in the results of the markets? And what do you do for those people who simply don't have the education, who don't have the skills? And we're going to hit this. This is going to become more and more difficult for us as we go to society where robots are going to do so much of the work, and where machines, little machines that we will have, 3D printers, will do half the manufacturing, and where machines will allow so much work to be done with so few people. But if you want to know where are the roots of that, it's Margaret Thatcher.
So you transitioned into the sort of broader policy questions and the contemporary policy questions. Let's talk about that a little bit further. There's no denying, obviously, that the world becomes flatter, in Tom Friedman's phrase, day by day. But there's a counter trend, and our current election is full of it, really. The counter trend in which people are sort of re-separating themselves along religious, ethnic, sectarian lines, and where there is, both literal and metaphorical walls going up. So your last chapter is an optimistic one. I'd like you to talk about that, but I also would like you to talk about the way in which globalization has created, and we see it in our politics, a backlash and a desire by many folks to separate.
That's a very good point. I get asked all the time, having written this book and thought so much about globalization, how do you think about the moment we're in? And this is a very, very dramatic moment. One of my characters is Andrew Grove, who is the person who basically manufactured, learned how to which is the one thing that is in every advanced piece of technology we have. And he developed, he had an expression, which I had not heard before, but it's called inflection point. An inflection point is when it's a point where virtually everything seems to change. So I would say we are at an inflection point of globalization now for all the reasons you said. First of all, trade, which since the Second World War, since the end of the Second World War, has increased, let's say, 3 times faster than world growth, has begun to level off. It's not even increasing as fast as world growth now. So for the first time in 60 or 70 years, trade is leveling off. Before the financial crisis in 2008, there was nobody who didn't believe that the global financial system was becoming bigger and more integrated as the rest of the world economy was. You heard about one global market, global banks, all this connectivity. But something weird is happening now, and that is that the global financial system is actually becoming compartmentalized. It is global, but it's far less global than it was 10 years ago, and the trends seem to be that every country wants its own financial system and is very concerned about the connections, because we saw that something that goes wrong in another country can rebound here very easily. And it's not just us, the Chinese feel that way, and the Europeans feel that way. So we're seeing a global economy that is actually becoming less global. The walls you talked about in the, we don't have, all I have to do is say refugees, and you know what I mean, that we are having I wrote something recently. The refugee situation in right after World War II was 10 times bigger than what we have now. 10 times bigger. There were 50 million, when I was a couple of weeks old going to Europe, there were 50 million refugees in Europe alone. My father, who was 26 at the time, there were no American bases in Europe. American soldiers took whatever houses were standing. We had a house on 3 floors, and my mother took in 4 German women who just happened to be passing by, brought them into the house. They were homeless, everything had been bombed out, and she said, "You can stay here forever, just take care of my little boy." And that's how I learned to speak German before I spoke English. But the world handled the refugees. We're not handling them now. And then all we have to do is look at our election, and I won't belabor this, but this election is the most, I'm not going to say anti-global. Globalization has nothing to do with it except negatively. So I get asked, you spent all this time writing about globalization. In a way, is that an epitaph? And my answer is no, because what I learned is that globalization is actually 60,000 years old. That globalization started when a couple of families in Africa stood up and walked out because they didn't have enough food and they were worried about the security around them. And ever since then, the world has been globalized. Sometimes it was fast and sometimes it was slow. And sometimes it was interrupted. For example, between the First World War and the Second World War, the Big Depression, there was no increase in globalization. And sometimes it backed up. And I think we're in a period now which is very hard to describe because there are parts of globalization that are slowing. There are parts that might be going into reverse. But if you talk about digitalized information, it's straight up. If you talk about the transmission of culture, I don't know, you would know, the number of students that are studying outside their own countries, that hasn't stopped, that has expanded enormously. And so parts of globalization are moving along. And I would say, I don't care what happens in this election. I mean, I do care, but for this, it doesn't matter what happens in this election. That 10 years from now or 20 years from now, when you draw the line, it's still going to be straight up. The only issue is how much damage do we do to ourselves in the interim, or how smart can we be to build the structures that allow us to benefit from globalization. And here I think is a really big issue. And I just speak as an American. For many, many years, we have been able to take advantage of globalization. It has been to our benefit. I sympathize with some of the candidates who are saying, wait a minute, we're taking too much for granted now. And a really good example is we negotiate these big trade agreements, which I'm all for. But we are past the stage where we can say, just because we have a trade agreement, that's good for us. We need something at home that helps people who get clobbered. We got too many people who can't adjust to more trade. And so, we have to focus on the domestic resilience. We have to focus on an education system that gives more Americans a chance to compete very, very vigorously with anybody in the world. We have to have an infrastructure, not the crumbling roads and the crumbling airports, that basically allow us to compete. So we have been asleep at the switch. We have thought that, gosh, this is still the 50s and 60s when we are reign supreme and we can take advantage of everything. We can't. There are too many other countries. It's what we wanted. They came up the ladder. So we have to figure out, somebody said this to me the other day, which is really, to reset the internal terms of globalization before we're going to be able to really embrace it. But one way or another, either we get left behind, either we have a lot of people who are very badly hurt. But the globalization, there's not going to be any stopping it. This is like this is a tsunami wave, which may slow a little bit, but it's coming. It can't be stopped.
Thank you. Going to open to questions from the audience. We have 2 microphones, so you can all be heard. Anybody would like to come up and ask a question?
Dr. Garten, I enjoyed the analogy you used to describe playing the transatlantic table as turning on a light in a dark room, and then following that, it sounds like the internet is just making the light brighter. What do you see as a still dark room, and what do you think turning the light on is going to change?
Well, I think one of the still dark rooms is I would say, is the education system. That we have a great higher education system in the U.S. Less so as secondary, but I think that we have to be far more imaginative in thinking about the kind of knowledge and the kind of experience and the kind of skills that we need. We are coasting on a model that was very good during most of the 20th century. And we just don't have a mechanism for education to reach everybody in the country in a way that would allow them to prosper in an age of high technology. And that doesn't mean everybody gets a PhD. In fact, it doesn't mean everybody even gets a college, a BA. But we've got to figure out how to prepare people for the new kinds of work and the new kinds of the way we're going to live in a very rapidly changing world, where work itself is going to look a lot different. And I don't know that we are even focused on the right thing with the right intensity. So I think that's a really, really big deal. And that, until that happens, we're going to see more elections like we have now, with people trying to put up the walls rather than saying we can compete. I'm as serious as I'm sounding. I'm optimistic because I can't imagine any country can solve this problem better than we can. I just don't think we're focused on it enough.
Thanks for taking the question.
Let me follow up real quickly on education. You were saying you did one of these interviews recently with Fareed Zakaria. He recently wrote a book in which he said, we really can't figure out how to train people for the next generation of work because we don't know what that's going to be with the changes in technology and robotics and so on. So the best thing to do is to go back to the sort of old-fashioned liberal arts education. Just sharpen people's critical thinking skills, give them basic, give them the classics, so to speak. And that's the best way to fit them in, rather than trying to have a sort of vocational orientation where we don't know what's really going to work. How would you respond to that approach?
Well, I'm sympathetic to that for some people. But there's no way you can convince me that we can't teach sort of science and technology at a level that gives people a facility for really understanding electronics. And that there's a kind of vocational aspect to it. We need a better vocabulary because that always has a connotation of limiting somebody's possibility. But I don't think it does. And I think that any way you look at it, all of this technology is going to require incremental improvement, and that's not going to come from somebody who understands the classics. So I think Fareed is right. He's right in the sense that we need many more people. I think one thing he's saying is there's a trend to say the classics don't matter, and that would really be terrible. But I just think, if I look at everybody in this room, we're not all going to be classicists. It's just not going to happen. And somebody's going to have to really understand, how the internet works, and how the next internet's going to work, and how cybersecurity, how you deal with cybersecurity. These are not. It's great if you have a liberal arts background, but it can't be at the expense of having people who really do things that are much more granular down there.
Please.
I think you stated the problem of Thatcherism and what has happened in the last 30 to 40 years in terms of rich and poor throughout the world as clearly as I've ever heard anybody say it. I think you've described the problems we're going through right now in terms of globalization and the fact that you can't stop it. And so our answer, what we need to do is figure out how to deal with it and how to work on it. Lovely. And I think education, I understand what you're saying. But now that you've stated the problems, A, would you run for president? And, but also, what do we do? How do we better convey that? Our news media is all obsessed with the size of Donald Trump's hands and not about where we should go as a country and the serious issues. And I don't think anybody on either side is really addressing the issues that you're talking about. What do we do?
Well, I don't know. But I tell you, I think that this kind of organization has, which exists all over the country, and you may do it, but, I think that your governors and your senators and all kinds of local leaders have to be exposed. Basically, they have to hear from you that what's going on at the national level is a total disgrace, and you want more discussion of the issues. You want your senator to address them, force them to address it. Let our we actually have, I think, a pretty sophisticated political establishment in terms of its structure. We don't have to depend only on the national level to get issues out. And I think we should put a lot more pressure on local officials saying, these are the things we care about. And, we're going to invite you here. We want your ideas on X, Y, and Z, and force them to think about it. Because I think more and more people have to realize that the national agenda is not about, building a wall between us and Mexico. That takes all, set aside the substance of it. It's taking all the air out of the balloon, and that isn't a big balloon. that's not the balloon that we want to be looking at. Please.
Hi, Professor. I think I'm lucky to attend this seminar. Thank you for your sharing. As you know, I'm probably the example of globalization. I come from China 4 years ago, and I grew up very poor family in the countryside China. Thanks to the globalization, so in the past 30 years, I can see, can feel the change, the dramatic change over 30 years. I think from my observation, my personal experience, we can see that globalization can bring huge benefit to us. But the problem is, over the last 30 years, the very beginning, we have a big gap between the two countries, right? So over time, they start to catch up, and the life becomes much better than before. At the same time, the expectation also build up. So now it becomes, less opportunity, or probably don't see the opportunity, to see as before. So we can see more problems or more competition than before. So from your point of view, what do you see if the gap becomes smaller and then become closer? What's it going to be for what's the next phase for globalization? So that's my question. Thank you.
So are you talking about the gap between the U.S. and China?
Yes, or any parties. From very beginning, if you have big gap, so it's easy to have for sharing or exchange, because if you can find a lot of opportunity, you can teach everybody, you can find a lot of resource from that. But the gap will become smaller because they can learn from each other. Normally, there's an acceleration for the weak part, and then the gap becomes smaller, then you'll see less opportunity. That's the question.
Let me put a sort of wrapper around it.
Yeah.
Right? So, starting with your father and his comrades going to Europe in the occupation, starting with that, the post-war United States created an international order. Institutions from the UN to the IMF, etc., created an order, had significant military spending throughout decade after decade to enforce that order, police that order. And, as you said, it worked. So countries, first the countries that had been devastated in the war came back, became competitors, including Japan and Europe. Then new giant powers like China have emerged, and you have this leveling where there is now a middle class in parts of Africa, there's a middle class in Latin America. So you could say this is the great triumph of American policy over 70 years. But it leads to the question, I think, that the gentleman's asking is, what do we do next? What's the next goal once we've sort of reached what we were setting out, knowingly or not so knowingly, to create? It seems to have generated a lot of anxiety in this country. That we are no longer the determinants of the world order, but rather we have these competitors that can hurt the real lives of real Americans at home. So I think that's kind of a little bit of a wrapper around it.
Well, in my view, the order that the U.S. created and to some degree enforced is still very much in our interest. It's just that we have to conduct ourselves a bit differently than we have in the past. It's not going to be as easy for us. We're not anywhere near as dominant as we were. And so we have to give much more attention to building ourselves from within. So I would say that the biggest foreign policy problem we have has to do with our domestic social policy. Because we were in great shape to deal with that world order before, in that we had the most competitive companies, we had an economy that was growing very fast, we had a monopoly on the best technology, and so it worked for us. But just to play an experiment, if that order changed now, it wouldn't change in some abstract way, it would change as a result of somebody else taking over from us. And just who would that be that we would be happy with? Can you imagine, and this is no offense, but can you imagine if somehow China was the leader of the global economy? country that is so overly centralized, in my view, it's going to fall apart. A country that is basically state-dominated, where the markets are much more run by the state than anything else. A country that is so highly repressive that it makes even our worst days look good. I mean, what kind of world would that be? And so we owe it to ourselves to continue to create a global order that is reasonably open, where people have as much free expression as they can, because that has a lot to do with markets. You can't, in my view, you can't have a repressive society and then on the other hand tell people to go out and express themselves in markets. It won't work. So we have an awful lot at stake in preserving this order. But in order to be successful, we have to make much more of an effort inside to compete, to be ready to compete, and to be sure that we're probably not going to grow as fast as we did in the past, which means we have a lot of people who are not automatically going to go into the middle class. In fact, they're going to have a very, very hard time, and we've got to have some policies that help them. So, same goal, but we have to run harder, we have to run faster. And the real problem we have is, I don't think as a country we actually get it. We're still thinking about marginal changes when I think those changes in terms of education and training and infrastructure and social safety net and healthcare and all those things, we're looking at the need for some very, very basic changes. And thus far we don't have that perspective. We have the lady over here.
Hi, good morning. My name is Launita. I'm with a group of students and teachers from William Bodine International High School for International Affairs. My question is, or what do you say about a lot of toll-free numbers, a lot of customer service and technical support jobs are overseas, specifically like in the Philippines, a lot in Asia and other countries. So, what do you say about that? Because all these customer service and other technical support jobs are being brought overseas, which eliminates or cut down employment here, and I'm thinking about the future of our young ones as well. And these jobs are like customer service support, technical support. When you have questions about computer, you're calling overseas. Even if when you watch on television, let's say you want to purchase a ticket, the show is right here in Philadelphia, the toll-free number is right there overseas, hello. And some other different, a good example are medical insurance companies. The big insurance companies, their customer support and claims processing are actually overseas, not here. So my really concern is, what do you say about that? Because to me it affects our future generation and employment as well. Thank you.
Well, I don't have a good answer. But I think that we have to be prepared for many jobs to go overseas where they can be done more efficiently and at lower cost. I don't know if there is something about call centers that would lend themselves to a more sophisticated approach that we could bring some of those jobs here. But rather than focus on what's going abroad, I would much rather focus on jobs that have not yet, sort of jobs of the future that are here. And, just to take an example, that in the healthcare arena and in the arena of working with older people, this is not stuff that's going to be outsourced. We have 75 million Americans that are going to be old and in need of assistance we are bringing in immigrants to work with them, and this is, I think, a great arena in which American citizens ought to find an awful lot of work, and they ought to do it not just in a rote way, but with innovation. We have to create people who are not just satisfied with doing the same thing over and over, like answering the phone, but we're thinking about how do you, every step of the way, how do you? I once had the chairman of Toyota in one of my classes, and he was explaining to our class that how it used to be in Japan. Now, it isn't now, but where if a Toyota, on the Toyota manufacturing floor, if a worker figured out a different way to stand in order to make the shave a second off the process, that worker was celebrated throughout the company. That is, they rewarded innovation, they rewarded the initiative, no matter how small it was. So that every one of those workers went to work that morning figuring, what can I do better? And if they could figure out how to do it a little bit better, they would be feted, and it was a big thing. I don't know that we have that culture here. My guess is that most call centers around the world, they don't operate that way. They just do what they have to do. They're just doing it cheaper. So we can't compete on price. Let's compete on something else. Let's compete on sheer quality. I'd much rather order a ticket from somebody who I can understand. But I need something else. I need more than just the answering on the phone. Last question.
Okay, my name is Sheena. I'm from Boutique High School, and I already know. You included 10 stories, although there were many that could be told. Does each person's story have a connecting theme which allows issues of globalization to be understood from every circumstance that global leaders from all over the world may be a part of?
Great, Renee.
What was the question?
What ties the stories together?
Oh, what ties? Oh, wonderful. You know, I should have planted that question. So I'm going to give you 4 points that I think all of the characters I wrote about have in common. Do we have 5 minutes? 4. 4. Okay. So the first is that they had what I would call pathological obsession with doing one and only one thing. You know, we tend to think that great leaders are sort of Renaissance people. They're very well-rounded. They do a million things. If you're really going to change the world, you have to basically, from a very early age, have one goal that has to be really big, and nothing can stop. If you can't do it, you fail, and that's your life is badly damaged. In other words, the stakes have to be very high, and you just have to put every ounce of yourself in it. And every one of the 10 characters that I wrote about, what they did, they had an idea when they were young. They all failed many times, but they all came back, and they knew exactly where they were going, and nothing could stop them. Second thing is that nobody really changes history. I use the expression, these 10 people, despite the fabulous things that they didn't bend the river. They just made the water go faster. And the flip side of that is, they picked their shot. I don't know how many people saw the play Hamilton in New York, but there's a whole, the first musical number is, I'm going to take my shot. Hamilton knew that this was the time, it was the American Revolution. He knew it was historical. Everybody that I wrote about, they picked a moment. Now, they were lucky because the moment came, it came when they were there. But it was a historical circumstance, and more times than not, that circumstance is when all the rules are being broken, all the underlying foundations are shaking. It's revolutionary. Things are chaotic, and that was their moment to basically drive right through that hole. And the third thing is, all these people who changed the world, they never set out to do that. They had no idea that they were going to change the world, and they couldn't give a whit about changing the world. They just saw a problem they wanted to solve. And it was a really big problem, and they did it in a really big way, and they were lucky that the times allowed them to do it. But they weren't idealists. They didn't sit around with their buddies saying, I wonder how I can change the world. That was not them. So I think that I concluded with, it's a sense of reality. I mean, there are a lot of people who want to change the world and do great things. I'm just saying they didn't really change the world the way that I intended. And I'll just end by saying that the last line of the book is really important to me anyway. It says, it just may be that the best is yet to come. And so ultimately, this is a really optimistic book. Because I'm saying I have identified these 10 people, and what they did was really hard to do when they did it. It's going to be a lot easier for those of you who are in school here. You have the tools that none of the 10 I wrote about ever had. You have technology nobody ever dreamed of. You have the ability to connect with anybody in the world. Many of you are coming from arenas, and they're more like you in the outskirts of Sao Paulo or Johannesburg or Manila, who were really not part of this world before. So we have a reservoir of talent and potential that the world has never seen. So I think that, I wrote about 10. Somebody in 200 years from now writes about the next 10. They'll have a much harder time picking 10 because they'll be 50.
Thank you. Thanks very much.